She didn't see him watching through the mesquite thorns, her black shawl torn at the edges, her small body shaking with each silent sob as she clutched the boy against her chest. The creek ran shallow that scorching August morning in 1847. Barely. Enough water to reflect the buzzards circling overhead, but her dark eyes stayed fixed on the child's fevered face as if her gaze alone could pull him back from death's door. From 30 yards away, hidden behind a cluster of prickly pear cactus, Nakona crouched motionless, his painted war lance gripped tight in his calloused hand. He had been tracking the Mexican soldiers who had burned his cousin's village for 3 days, following their trail of destruction across the Texas plains. But he hadn't expected to find this woman here, alone and defenseless in Comanche territory, where no Mexican dared to venture. Her hair was too black, her skin too pale for Apache, her dress sewn in the style of the Mexican settlements far to the south. But the child in her arms, something about the way his small chest rose and fell with labored breathing, the way she whispered prayers in Spanish mixed with words he didn't recognize, pulled at something deep in Nakona's warrior heart. She looked like a woman who had already lost everything and was now watching the last piece of her world slip away. The boy couldn't have been more than 4 winters old, his dark hair matted with sweat, his tiny fists clenched against some invisible pain. She rocked him gently, humming a lullaby that carried on the hot wind, and Nakona found himself listening to the melody, remembering his own mother's voice before the soldiers had silenced it forever. The woman's tears fell onto the child's forehead, and she wiped them away with the corner of her shawl, as if ashamed of her grief. Nakona had killed 7 Mexican soldiers in the past moon alone, each one a small payment against the debt they owed his people. His war paint was still fresh from the last raid, red and black stripes across his bronze cheeks that marked him as a warrior of the Nakoni band, the most feared fighters on the southern plains. The woman would know these markings if she saw. Them would know that her life was forfeit simply for being here, for carrying the blood of those who had murdered Comanche children and called it God's work. But something stayed his hand as he watched her press her lips to the boy's burning forehead, heard her voice crack as she spoke to him in that musical Spanish tongue. "Miguel, mi corazón, stay with Mama. Don't leave me alone in this world, my little star." The words were foreign, but the pain in them was universal, the same anguish he had heard in his sister's voice when her own son had died from the white man's spotted sickness. Nakona shifted his weight, and a small stone skittered down the creek bank. The woman's head snapped up, her dark eyes wide with terror as they searched the mesquite brush. For a heartbeat, hunter and prey stared at each other across the shimmering heat, and he saw something in her gaze that gave him pause. Not the blank fear of a sheep facing the wolf, but the desperate fury of a mother protecting her young, ready to die fighting rather than watch her child suffer. She didn't run, she didn't scream. Instead, she pulled the boy closer and slowly, rose to her feet, her torn skirts dripping creek water, her chin lifted in defiance despite the tears still streaming down her cheeks. "Por favor," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the buzz of insects. "He's dying. If you must kill us, at least let it be quick." Her Spanish accent was thick, but she spoke the Comanche words with surprising accuracy, as if she had taken pains to learn them. Nakona felt his grip tighten on the war lance, felt the familiar surge of battle rage that had carried him through a dozen raids. But the boy chose that moment to whimper, a small sound of pure misery that cut through. The warrior's anger like a blade through rawhide. The child's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises so dark they seemed black, and in them Nakona saw not the enemy, but simply a dying child who looked exactly like his nephew had in those final, terrible days. Without conscious thought, Nakona stepped from the shadows, his painted face grim in the morning light. The woman gasped and stumbled backward, but her feet tangled in her wet skirts, and she fell hard, still clutching the boy against her chest. She looked up at him, with the cornered desperation of a wounded animal waiting for the killing blow that she knew must come. But instead of raising his weapon, Nakona did something that surprised them both. He knelt slowly, deliberately, and laid his war lance on the rocky ground between them, the polished steel point catching the sunlight. It was a gesture his grandfather had taught him long ago, a sign of truce among warriors, though he had never used it with an enemy before. The woman stared at the weapon, then at his face, confusion replacing fear in her dark eyes. "Your son," Nakona said in careful Spanish, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "He has the burning sickness." It wasn't a question. He had seen. Too many children die from fever to mistake the signs. The glazed eyes, the shallow breathing, the way the small body trembled with heat even in the shade. Without proper medicine, the boy would be dead before the sun reached its peak. The woman nodded, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks. "See," she whispered. 3 days now. I've tried everything, but the fever won't break. I came to the creek, hoping the cool water might help, but she couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that was eating her alive from the inside. Her child was dying, and she was powerless to stop it. Nakona studied her face, reading the exhaustion. In every line, the way her hands shook from more than fear. "You have no man?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. No Mexican husband would allow his wife to wander into Comanche lands alone, not unless he was already dead. "No family to help you?" The question was gentler than his usual tone, but she flinched anyway, as if the words themselves were weapons. "Dead," she said simply, the word falling between them like a stone into still water. "The Rangers came to our village 2 weeks ago. They said we were harboring Apache raiders, but we had never seen any Apache. They burned everything, killed everyone who tried to stop them." Her voice was steady now, numbed by grief too vast for tears. "Miguel and I hid in the root cellar until they left. When we came out, there was nothing left." Nakona's jaw tightened. He knew the Rangers she spoke of, the brutal men who rode the borderlands claiming to protect settlers while slaughtering anyone with brown skin who crossed their path. They were worse than regular soldiers, these Rangers, because they answered to no law but their own hatred. He had tangled with them before, had sent several to meet their maker, but there were always more to take their places. "The boy's father?" he pressed, though something in her expression warned him the answer would bring more pain. She looked down at the child in her arms, stroking his fevered brow with infinite tenderness, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper carried on the desert wind. "Joaquin was trying to save the church when a beam fell on him. He died calling my name, telling me to take Miguel and run." Her composure cracked then, and she bent over her son, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "I couldn't even bury him properly. I just grabbed what I could carry and started walking north, thinking maybe we could reach the missions in San Antonio. But Miguel got sick and I didn't know what else to do." The creek bubbled quietly between them as Nakona processed her words. A widow, alone in the wilderness, carrying a dying child, and running from the same men who had destroyed his own people time and again. By all rights, he should see her as the enemy, another Mexican intruder on Comanche lands who deserved whatever. Fate the spirits decreed, but looking at her now, seeing the fierce love in her eyes as she held her son, he found his anger cooling like embers in morning frost. "There is medicine," he said finally, the admission feeling like a betrayal of everything he had been taught about dealing with outsiders. Willow bark tea mixed with certain roots. "It can break the fever, but it must be prepared correctly, and the boy must drink it while it's still warm." He paused, studying her face for some sign of hope or deception, but saw only desperate gratitude. Her eyes widened. "You would help us? But I am..." She gestured helplessly at her Mexican features, her torn dress, everything that marked her as other in this harsh land where tribes and settlers had been killing each other for generations. The question hung unfinished in the air between them, heavy with the weight of old hatreds and fresh grief. "You are a mother," Nakona said simply, and in those 4 words lay a truth that transcended race and history and the bitter politics of the frontier. He had watched his own sister die, trying to save her child from the white man's diseases, had held his nephew as the fever consumed him despite all the medicine songs and healing ceremonies. He would not watch another mother bury her son if he could prevent it. The boy stirred in her arms, mumbling something in Spanish that might have been a prayer or a plea. His small face was flushed red with fever, and when his mother touched his forehead, she jerked her hand back as if burned. "He's getting worse," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "Por favor, if you know how to help him, I'll give you anything. I have nothing left to trade." But Nakona held up a hand to stop her desperate bargaining. "Save your words," he said, rising smoothly to his feet and retrieving his war lance. For a moment, fear flashed across her face again, but he simply turned the weapon around and used the blunt end to point toward a grove of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile upstream. "There is shelter there and clean water. Can you carry him that far?" She struggled to her feet, cradling Miguel against her chest with fierce protectiveness. "See, yes, I can make it." Her voice was stronger now, fueled by the first hope she had felt in days. She took a tentative step toward the trees, then stopped and turned back to him. "Why are you doing this? Your people and mine, we are enemies. You could have killed us both, and no one would have blamed you." Nakona was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes distant as he watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of old sorrows and hard-won wisdom. "My nephew died from the burning sickness 3 winters ago. I held him as he died, watched my sister tear her hair and cut her arms in grief. If there is medicine that can save your boy, then perhaps his spirit will find peace, knowing that another child lived." The woman's face crumpled with emotion, and for a heartbeat Nakona thought she might collapse under the weight of gratitude and relief. But she straightened her shoulders and nodded firmly, the strength of generations of frontier women flowing through her small frame. "Gracias," she whispered, the word carrying more meaning than any elaborate speech could have conveyed. They walked toward the cottonwoods in silence, the warrior moving with the fluid grace of a man born to hunt and fight, the woman stumbling slightly on the uneven ground, but never loosening her grip on her precious burden. Behind them, the creek continued its quiet song, and the buzzards wheeled away to find easier prey elsewhere on the vast Texas plains. As they reached the shade of the trees, Nakona gestured for her to sit on a fallen log while he began gathering the materials he would need for the medicine: willow bark, purple coneflower roots, leaves from the fever plant his grandmother had shown him as a boy. The woman watched him work with wide eyes, still hardly believing that salvation had come from such an unexpected source. "What is your name?" she asked softly as he stripped bark from a young willow with his hunting knife. It seemed important, suddenly, to know the name of the man who might save her son's life, this Comanche warrior who had chosen mercy over vengeance when either would have been justified by the brutal logic of the frontier. "Nakona," he replied without looking up from his work. "It means wanderer in my tongue." "And you are called what?" The question was formal, polite, as if they were meeting in a mission courtyard rather than a hidden grove where he was preparing medicine for her dying child, using knowledge passed down through generations of his people. "Catalina." "Reyes," she answered, instinctively rocking Miguel as his breathing grew more labored. "This is my son, Miguel Joaquin Reyes. He is named for his father and his grandfather, both good men who never hurt anyone." There was pride in her voice along with the grief, a mother's need to honor her child even in the face of death. Nakona nodded gravely as he began building a small fire with practiced efficiency. "Miguel," he repeated, testing the foreign name on his tongue. "In my language, we would call him Ayanaka, little star, for even the smallest star gives light in the darkness." He glanced up at her, and she saw something unexpected in his fierce features. Gentleness, the same tender expression he might show to his own child. The medicine took time to prepare properly, the bark and roots needing to steep in water heated to just the right temperature, no hotter. While they waited, Catalina told him more of her story, speaking in a mixture of Spanish and broken English and the few Comanche phrases she had learned from traders over the years. She had been married to Joaquin for 6 years, had buried 2 other babies who lived only days, treasured Miguel all the more for being her miracle child who survived. Nakona listened without judgment, occasionally feeding twigs to the small, fire or adjusting the position of the clay pot he had pulled from his travel pack. He spoke little, but when he did, it was to ask careful questions about the boy's symptoms, his age, how long he had been sick. Professional questions from someone who had seen many fevers and knew the difference between those that could be broken and those that could not. When the medicine was ready, fragrant steam rising from the clay vessel, Nakona carefully poured a portion into a smaller cup made from a gourd. He tested the temperature against his wrist, the gesture so familiar and paternal that Catalina felt tears spring to her eyes again. This man, this supposed enemy, was handling her son's cure with the same tender care she would have shown. "He must drink it all," Nakona said, offering her the cup. "It will taste bitter, and he may fight you, but every drop is important. Then we wait, and pray to whatever spirits watch over sick children, and see if the fever breaks before sunset." His dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw not false hope, but honest assessment. They were gambling with death, and the odds were still uncertain. Catalina took the cup with trembling hands, feeling its warmth seep through the gourd shell into her palms. "And if it doesn't work?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. She had to prepare herself for the possibility that even this unexpected mercy might not be enough to save her child. Nakona's expression grew somber as he banked the fire and began cleaning his medicine implements with the methodical care of a man who had learned that preparation and cleanliness could mean the difference between life and death. "Then I will help you bury him according to your customs," he said quietly, "and I will make sure you reach safety before the other war parties find you. This I promise on my father's grave." The words should have terrified her, the casual mention of other warriors who might not be so merciful, but instead Catalina felt an odd sense of peace settle over her shoulders like a well-worn shawl. Whatever happened now, she would not face it alone. This strange, fierce man had given her more than medicine. He had given her hope and companionship in her darkest hour. She lifted Miguel higher in her arms and began the delicate process of coaxing the bitter brew between his fevered lips, one tiny sip at a time, while Nakona watched with the focused intensity of a hunter waiting for his prey to show itself. The afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwood leaves, painting shifting patterns of light and shadow across their small camp. And somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird began its elaborate song. The medicine was strong and strange, tasting of earth and growing things and the wild spaces where only the native peoples knew which plants could heal and which could kill. Miguel fought the first few sips, his small face screwing up in distaste, but Catalina persisted with the patient determination of mothers everywhere, whispering endearments and promises until he had swallowed every bitter drop. The medicine began its work as the sun climbed higher, but not in the way Catalina had hoped. Miguel's fever spiked dangerously in the first hour, his small body convulsing with chills despite the blazing Texas heat, and she found herself fighting panic as she watched her son slip further from her grasp. Nocona remained calm, checking the boy's pulse at his throat and wrists with the practiced touch of someone who had seen many healing ceremonies, but she caught the flash of concern that crossed his weathered features. "This is normal," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words. "The medicine must drive out the sickness before it can heal, but we must watch him carefully now, keep his body cool while the fever burns." He disappeared into the brush and returned with handfuls of broad leaves that he soaked in the creek, before placing them gently on Miguel's forehead and chest. The boy whimpered at the cold touch but didn't wake. Catalina had never felt so helpless in her life, not even during those terrible hours when the Rangers had burned her village. Then, at least, she had been able to run, to hide, to take some action, however futile. Now she could only sit and watch while invisible forces battled for her son's life, his fate hanging on the wisdom of plants she didn't recognize and the skill of a man she had met only hours before. But as the afternoon wore on, something extraordinary began to happen. Nocona didn't simply tend Miguel's physical symptoms. He began to sing, low chants in the Comanche language that seemed to rise from some ancient place deep in his chest. The melodies were unlike anything Catalina had ever heard, neither the Latin hymns of her childhood nor the Mexican folk songs Joaquin had taught her, but something older and wilder that seemed to call directly to the spirits of wind and water. "What are those songs?" she asked during a lull when he paused to check Miguel's breathing. The boy's fever was still dangerously high, but his sleep seemed more peaceful now, less restless, as if the music had somehow reached him, even in his delirium. Nocona's eyes held a distant look, as if part of his spirit was traveling paths she couldn't see. "Medicine songs," he replied, settling cross-legged beside the makeshift bed of blankets where Miguel lay. "My grandmother taught them to me before the soldiers killed her. She said that sickness is not just in the body, but in the spirit too. And sometimes music is the only thing that can call a lost soul back home." He resumed his chanting, and Catalina found herself swaying slightly to the rhythm despite her fear. As evening approached and the fever showed no sign of breaking, Nocona made a decision that surprised them both. He began to remove his war paint, using water from the creek to wash away the red and black stripes that marked him as a warrior on the hunt. Beneath the paint, his face was younger than she had thought, probably no more than 25 winters, with high cheekbones and eyes that held depths of experience far beyond his years. "Why are you doing that?" Catalina asked, watching him. "Scrub away the symbols of his identity as a feared Comanche raider." Without the paint, he looked less like the terrifying savage her people spoke of in hushed whispers, and more like any young man who might have courted her in the villages of her youth if circumstances had been different. "The paint is for war," Nocona said simply, braiding his long black hair with small bones and feathers that she now realized were medicine charms rather than battle trophies. "Tonight I am not a warrior. Tonight I am a healer, and the spirits must see me as I truly am if they are to trust me with your son's life." The transformation was remarkable. Stripped of his war regalia, he possessed a gentle dignity that spoke of wisdom beyond his years. The real test came near midnight, when Miguel's fever reached its crisis point. His small body burned with such intensity that the wet leaves Nocona had placed on his skin turned warm within minutes, and his breathing became so shallow that twice Catalina thought he had stopped altogether. She knelt beside him, one hand on his chest, feeling for the flutter of his heartbeat, the other clutched around the small wooden cross her grandmother had given her. But Nocona had not given up. He built the fire higher and began preparing. A second medicine, this one more complex than the first, involving roots that had to be ground to powder and mixed with clay from the creek bank. His movements were swift and sure, guided by knowledge passed down through generations of healers, but Catalina could see the tension in his shoulders as he worked against time. "Tell me about your village," he said suddenly, his hands never pausing in their work. "Tell me about the life you had before the rangers came. Sometimes the spirits need to hear about joy before they will grant healing." His request caught her off guard, but she found herself speaking of things she thought she had buried with Joaquin's death. She told him about their small adobe house with its red tile roof, about the garden where she had grown corn and beans, and chili peppers that made Joaquin sweat and curse good-naturedly. She described the feast day celebrations when the whole village would gather in the plaza to dance and share food, when Miguel would toddle between the musicians with his chubby hands outstretched, trying to catch the notes that floated through the air. As she spoke, something miraculous began to happen. Miguel's breathing deepened, and the terrible heat that had been radiating from his small body began to ease. Nocona noticed it first, his medicine-trained senses more attuned to the subtle changes, and he caught Catalina's eye with the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "The fever is breaking," he said quietly, testing the boy's forehead with the back of his hand. "Keep talking. Tell me more about your husband, about the man who made this beautiful child." There was no jealousy in his request, no masculine posturing, just the understanding that love stories had power, that speaking of happiness could sometimes call it back into the world. So Catalina found herself describing Joaquin as she had never described him before, not as the dead martyr she mourned, but as the living man she had loved. She told Nocona about his terrible singing voice that could make the chickens stop laying, about his skill with wood carving that had produced most of the village's finest furniture, about the way he would dance with Miguel on his shoulders during festivals until both father and son were dizzy with laughter. By dawn, the crisis had passed completely. Miguel's fever broke in a rush of perspiration that soaked through his clothes, and when he finally opened his eyes, they were clear and alert, instead of glazed with delirium. He looked first at his mother's tear-streaked face, then at the strange man sitting nearby, and instead of crying, he smiled with the resilient joy that only children possess. "Mama," he said, in a voice hoarse from fever, but blessedly strong, "I dreamed about Papa. He said the singing man was going to help us." He struggled to sit up, and Catalina supported him carefully, hardly daring to believe that her son was truly returning to her. Nocona watched the reunion with satisfaction, already beginning to pack away his medicine supplies. But Miguel's recovery brought new complications that none of them had anticipated. The boy was fascinated by Nocona, chattering away in Spanish and broken English, asking endless questions about the feathers in his hair and the interesting scars that marked his arms. More troubling for Catalina was the way Nocona responded, his stern warrior's mask slipping to reveal genuine fondness for her curious, fearless child. "He has the heart of a warrior," Nocona observed, as Miguel attempted to imitate the way. He sat cross-legged, his small face serious with concentration, but also the spirit of a peacemaker. "This is rare among men." He offered the boy a piece of dried buffalo meat from his travel pack, and Miguel accepted it gravely, as if receiving a sacred trust. The peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple riders moving fast across the hardpan desert. Nocona was on his feet instantly, his warrior instincts overriding the healer's gentle demeanor of the night before. He snatched up his war lance and motioned for Catalina to gather Miguel behind the largest cottonwood. "Rangers," she whispered, her newfound hope curdling into familiar terror. She had thought they were beyond pursuit here in Comanche territory, but perhaps the same lawlessness that made these lands dangerous for her also made them attractive to men who preferred to operate outside the reach of formal authority. Nakona shook his head, listening to sounds she couldn't distinguish. "Comanche," he said grimly. "A war party moving fast. They have found our trail." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His face had hardened back into the mask of the feared warrior, but she caught the flash of genuine concern in his eyes. "They will not understand why I am here with you instead of taking scalps." The riders burst into the grove with war whoops that made Miguel press closer to his mother's side, though his young eyes were bright with excitement rather than fear. 5 mounted warriors, their horses, lathered with sweat, war paint fresh on their faces, and weapons ready. They surrounded the small camp with the fluid precision of men who had ridden together for years. The leader was an older man, perhaps 40 winters, with silver threading through his black braids and scars that told of many battles. His eyes fixed on Catalina and Miguel with unmistakable hostility before turning to Nakona with a mixture of anger and confusion. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a war chief accustomed to absolute obedience. "Nakona, son of my sister, what madness is this?" The older warrior dismounted and strode forward, his lance held ready. "We have ridden hard to find you after your horse returned without its rider, fearing you were dead or captured. Instead, we find you playing nursemaid to Mexican spawn while our enemies burn Comanche lodges and steal our horses." Catalina didn't understand all the rapid Comanche being spoken, but she recognized the deadly tension crackling between the two men. This was clearly Nakona's family, his war band, and they viewed his mercy toward her and Miguel as betrayal of the worst kind. She pulled her son closer, wrapping her shawl around them both as if it could shield them from the hatred in the other. "Warrior's eyes!" Nakona straightened to his full height, meeting his uncle's glare without flinching. "The child was dying, uncle. Would you have me watch a warrior's spirit fade when I had medicine to save him?" He gestured toward Miguel, who peered out from behind his mother with wide, curious eyes. "Look at him. Does he cower like a weakling?" He faced death with courage and asked for stories, not mercy. The war chief's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in his eyes as he studied the small boy who stared back at him with more interest than fear. "He has spirit, I will grant that, but he is still Mexican, still the blood of our enemies. And she—" He turned his hostile gaze on Catalina, who lifted her chin despite her terror. "She carries the look of those who burned Three Bears village and killed his youngest wife. She is widow to such burnings, not cause of them," Nakona said firmly, and Catalina felt a rush of gratitude that he would defend her even to his own family. "Rangers destroyed her village as they destroyed ours. She and the boy are refugees, not enemies." The explanation seemed to surprise the other warriors, who exchanged glances and lowered their weapons slightly, but the war chief was not convinced. "Pretty words, nephew, but Rangers or not, they are still Mexican. Their people have taken our lands, enslaved our children, poisoned our waterholes with their cattle. What makes these two different from all the others who deserve death for the sins of their race?" The challenge hung heavy in the morning air. Miguel chose that moment to do something that changed everything. He stepped out from behind his mother's protection and walked directly to the war chief's painted horse, a magnificent stallion that stood 16 hands high and bore the scars of many battles. Instead of shying away from the animal's size and fierce appearance, the boy reached out to touch the horse's muzzle with gentle fingers. The stallion, trained for war and notorious for biting anyone except its master, lowered its great head and nickered softly at Miguel's touch. The boy laughed with delight and began speaking to the animal in Spanish, his voice carrying the universal language of childhood wonder. Every warrior in the grove stared in amazement as the fierce warhorse nuzzled Miguel like a gentle mare with her foal. "I," breathed one of the younger warriors. "The spirits speak through the child. Warhorse has never let another touch him, not even the medicine man." The superstitious murmur that ran through the group was cut short by their leader's sharp gesture, but Catalina could see that Miguel's innocent display had shaken their certainty. The war chief dismounted and approached Miguel slowly, studying the boy with new eyes. "You are not afraid of Warhorse, little one?" he asked in careful Spanish, his voice gentler than it had been with the adults. Miguel looked up at him with the fearless curiosity of childhood, apparently unaware that his life hung in the balance. "He's lonely," Miguel said simply, continuing to stroke the stallion's nose. "Like we were before the singing man helped us. Papa always said animals know when people are sad." The innocence of his observation struck the hardened warriors like a physical blow, and Catalina saw several of them exchange meaningful glances. The war chief was silent for a long moment, his weathered features unreadable as he watched his feared warhorse gentle under a child's touch. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of difficult decision. "The child has medicine," he admitted grudgingly. "Perhaps the spirits brought you to him for reasons we do not understand, nephew." But even as the immediate danger seemed to pass, Catalina could see new complications arising. The other warriors were clearly struggling with their leader's acceptance of her and Miguel, their faces showing the conflict between tribal law and the evidence of their own eyes. One of them, a young man with fresh scalps hanging from his belt, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "War chief," he said carefully, "if we let them live, what message does this send? Other Mexicans will hear that Comanche warriors spare their enemies, that we have grown soft. Our reputation is our greatest weapon." His words carried wisdom that even Catalina could appreciate, the hard logic of survival on a frontier where weakness meant death. The war chief nodded slowly, acknowledging the validity of the concern. "You speak truth, Broken Arrow. But look, at the signs." He gestured toward Miguel, still happily petting the warhorse, then at Nakona, who stood protectively near mother and child. "My nephew, who has never shown mercy to an enemy, risks his standing in the tribe for these two. Warhorse, who has killed 3 men for approaching too close, accepts a Mexican child's touch. Are these not messages from the spirit world?" The debate that followed was conducted in rapid Comanche that left Catalina struggling to follow, but she caught enough words to understand that her fate and Miguel's were being decided by men who viewed them as less than human. Yet gradually she began to sense that the tide was turning in their favor, that Nakona's passionate defense and Miguel's innocent charm were having an effect on even the hardest hearts. The turning point came when Miguel, growing tired from his recent illness, climbed onto Warhorse's back without asking permission and promptly fell asleep between the animal's shoulder blades. The stallion stood perfectly still, as gentle as a rocking chair, while the child dozed in the morning sun. Not one of the warriors had ever seen such a thing, and the supernatural implications were impossible to ignore. "The spirits have chosen," the war chief said finally, his decision clearly made. "The woman and child are under our protection now, but they cannot return to the Mexican settlements. They know too much of our movements, our hiding places. They must come with us, learn our ways, become part of the tribe." He looked directly at Catalina, his eyes still hard but no longer hostile. "Do you understand what this means, woman?" Catalina nodded slowly, her mind reeling with the implications. She was being offered survival, but at the cost of everything she had ever known. She would never see another Mexican settlement, never hear Mass in Spanish again, never visit Joaquin's grave or honor his memory in the traditional ways. But Miguel would live, would grow up strong and free instead of dying by a lonely creek. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the choice. "We accept your protection and will honor your ways." The words felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness. But as she looked at Miguel sleeping peacefully on the war horse, she knew she would make the same decision 1,000 times. Nakona stepped forward, relief evident in his features. "I will be responsible for them," he declared, formally accepting the burden of their integration into Comanche society. "I will teach them our language, our customs, ensure they bring no shame to the tribe." The older warrior nodded approvingly, recognizing the seriousness of the commitment. As the morning sun climbed higher and the warriors began preparing to break camp, Catalina found herself looking back toward the south one last time, toward the life she was leaving forever. Somewhere beyond those rolling hills lay the ruins of her village, the unmarked grave where Joaquin's bones would bleach in the Texas sun. She whispered a final prayer for his soul, then turned her face north toward an uncertain but hopeful future. The last thing she did before they rode out was kneel beside the creek where Miguel had nearly died, filling a small clay jar with water from the stream where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. She would keep it always. This water that had witnessed miracles, as a reminder of the day a Comanche warrior had chosen mercy over vengeance and changed the course of 3 lives forever. The Comanche village materialized from the prairie, like something born of earth and sky, a collection of buffalo-hide teepees arranged in careful circles that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the wind. Catalina had never seen anything like it in her sheltered life among the adobe houses and stone churches of Mexican settlements. Here was a city that could move with the seasons, following the great herds across endless grasslands that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. Miguel rode before her on a gentle mare the war chief had provided, his small hands gripping the horse's mane with the confidence of a child who had already forgotten what it meant to walk everywhere. The fever had left him thinner, but somehow older, his dark eyes taking in every detail of this strange new world with the adaptability that only children possess. He pointed excitedly at everything, chattering in Spanish that gradually mixed with Comanche words he was picking up from the warriors. But it was the women who truly terrified Catalina as they rode into the village center. They emerged from their teepees like ghosts materializing from smoke, their faces painted with designs she couldn't read, their dark eyes measuring her with a hostility far more personal than anything the men had shown. These were the mothers and wives and sisters of warriors who had died fighting her people, and she could feel their collective judgment like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. Nakona rode beside her, his presence both protection and target, and she could see the questioning looks the villagers gave him. Word of his unprecedented mercy had already spread through some invisible network of communication, and she realized that his decision to save Miguel had cost him more than she had understood. Warriors who had once greeted him with respect now watched him with uncertainty, wondering if he had been weakened by his contact with Mexican blood. The war chief's teepee stood at the center of the village, its hide walls decorated with paintings that told the story of his victories in battle. Here lived Crow Feather, the man whose word could mean life or death, not just for Catalina and Miguel, but for Nakona as well. The older warrior dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose bones had been broken too many times, but his mind remained sharp as obsidian as he studied the crowd gathering around them. "Bring the woman and child to my lodge," Crowfeather commanded, his voice carrying easily across the village center. "Let the elders see what the spirits have sent us, and let them decide if this mercy my nephew has shown will bring blessing, or curse upon our people." The formal words sent a chill through Catalina, who understood enough Comanche by now to recognize the tone of a man calling council. Inside the teepee, the air was thick with sage smoke and the weight of tradition. 7 elders sat in a careful circle, their faces marked with the ritual scars that spoke of vision quests and sacred ceremonies she would never understand. At their center sat an ancient woman, whose blind eyes seemed to see more than those blessed. With sight, her gnarled hands working constantly at a piece of beadwork that told stories in colors and patterns. "Grandmother," Crowfeather said, using the title of respect for the tribe's most senior elder, "this is the Mexican woman Mai, nephew saved, and her son who speaks to horses with the voice of spirits." The old woman set down her beadwork and raised her face toward them, her milky eyes somehow finding Catalina despite their blindness. What followed was unlike anything Catalina had experienced in the Catholic churches of her youth. The elder woman began to speak in a voice like wind through dry grass, words that seemed to come from some deep well of memory that reached back to the beginning of the world. She spoke of signs and portents, of children born during eclipses, of the way the spirits sometimes used the most unlikely messengers to deliver their most important truths. Miguel, exhausted from the long ride and overwhelmed by the strangeness of everything around him, had fallen asleep in Catalina's arms during the ceremony. But the blind elder's words seemed to reach him even in slumber, and he stirred restlessly, mumbling something in Spanish that made the old woman's head snap up with sudden attention. "What does he say?" she demanded, and Catalina found herself translating her son's sleep-talking for a council of Comanche elders, her voice barely steady enough to form the words. "He says there are buffalo coming from the north, many buffalo, and the grass will be good this season for the horses." The prophecy from the lips of a fevered child who had never seen a buffalo in his life sent ripples of unease through the assembled council. The testing began immediately, not the gentle integration Catalina had hoped for, but a series of trials that would determine whether she and Miguel would be accepted as tribal members or cast out to die on the plains. The first test came from Strong Bear Woman, the war chief's eldest wife, who emerged from the shadows of the teepee like a force of nature carved from granite and disappointment. "If you would eat our food and sleep under our protection," Strong Bear Woman announced, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had buried 3 sons in battles against Mexican soldiers, "then you must prove you can contribute to the tribe's survival. Can you tan hides? Can you preserve meat? Can you work until your hands bleed and never complain?" The challenge was delivered with the cold precision of an arrow finding its mark. What followed were the longest days of Catalina's life. Dawn to dusk lessons in survival skills that Mexican women were never taught. She learned to scrape buffalo hides until her arms ached and her palms were raw with blisters, learned to identify which prairie plants could be eaten and which would kill, learned to set snares for rabbits and process their meat into jerky that would keep through the harsh winter months ahead. But it was the language lessons with Nakona that proved most challenging, not because Comanche was difficult to learn, but because of the growing tension between them. He was patient with her stumbling pronunciation and Miguel's endless questions, but she could see the weight he carried, the way other warriors now looked at him with speculation rather than automatic respect. "Did I destroy your standing in the tribe?" she asked him one evening, as they sat beside the small fire outside the teepee that had been assigned to her and Miguel. The boy was already asleep, curled up in buffalo robes that still smelled of the great beasts whose hides provided warmth and shelter. Nakona was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "A warrior's reputation is like water," he said finally, poking at the coals with a stick worn smooth by countless hands. "It can be lost in a moment of carelessness, but it can also be rebuilt drop by drop through right action. I do not regret saving Miguel's life, but I would be lying if I said there was no cost." His honesty hit her like a physical blow, and she felt the familiar weight of guilt settling on her shoulders. The real test came 3 weeks after their arrival, when scouts returned with news that sent the entire village into a frenzy of preparation. A large herd of buffalo had been spotted moving south along the Canadian River, exactly as Miguel had predicted in his fevered sleep, and Crow Feather declared it a sign that the spirits approved of their new members. But with the hunt came danger, and tradition demanded that every member of the tribe contribute to its success. "You will ride with the women," Strong Bear Woman informed Catalina, her tone suggesting this was less invitation than command. "We follow the hunters to process the kills, and we must work quickly before the meat spoils. If you cannot keep up, if you slow us down, you and your son will be left behind." The threat was delivered matter-of-factly, without malice but with absolute certainty. The buffalo hunt was unlike anything Catalina had ever witnessed, a choreographed dance of death and survival that had been perfected over countless generations. She watched from a distant hill as Nakona and the other warriors rode into the thundering herd, their horses trained to dance between the massive beasts while their riders drove arrows and lances into precisely targeted spots that would bring quick, clean kills. But Miguel saw something the adults had missed, his child's eyes catching movement in the tall grass that the experienced hunters had overlooked. "Mama," he said urgently, tugging at her sleeve as she watched the hunt unfold. "Below, there are men hiding in the rocks, bad men with guns." His words sent ice through her veins as she followed his pointing finger and saw what he had spotted. A band of Texan Rangers had been tracking the same buffalo herd, hoping to ambush any Indians who came to hunt. They lay concealed among the boulder field at the canyon's mouth, their rifles trained on the hunting party below, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. Catalina's throat went dry as she realized that Nakona and the other warriors were riding directly into a killing ground. She had perhaps 30 seconds to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could stay silent, let the Rangers spring their ambush, and watch the men who had shown her mercy die in a hail of bullets. Or she could warn the hunters and forever mark herself as truly Comanche in the eyes of both sides of this bitter frontier war. "Rangers," she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying across the canyon in a shrill warning that froze every hunter in his tracks. "In the rocks, they have rifles." The Spanish words meant nothing to most of the warriors, but the terror in her voice was universal, and they began looking around frantically for the source of the threat. The Rangers' trap had been perfectly laid, but it depended on surprise, and Catalina's warning had stolen that from them. The hunters scattered like leaves in a windstorm, their war horses carrying them away from the killing zone in great bounding leaps that spoke of training and trust between rider and mount. The Rangers' first volley whistled harmlessly through empty air, where moments before a dozen Comanche warriors had been perfect targets. What followed was a running battle across the prairie that lasted until sunset, with the Rangers superior. Firepower offset by the Comanches' knowledge of the terrain and their superior horsemanship. 3 Rangers died before the survivors managed to reach their horses and flee toward the safety of the settlements, leaving their ambush site littered with ammunition and equipment in their haste to escape. When the warriors returned to the village that night, they brought with them not just fresh meat and hides, but a new understanding of where Catalina's loyalties truly lay. She had chosen to warn them at the cost of marking herself as traitor to her own race, and that choice had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to Ranger bullets. Crow Feather himself came to her teepee that evening, his war paint still fresh from the day's fighting, his eyes holding a respect that hadn't been there before. "You saved my nephew's life," he said simply, settling cross-legged beside her fire, as if she were a war chief rather than a Mexican refugee. "You saved the lives of men who would have died because they trusted the spirits to protect them in their sacred hunt." "I couldn't watch good men die in an ambush," Catalina replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she had done. "Rangers killed my husband, burned my village. They are my enemies too now." The declaration hung in the air between them, a bridge burned that could never be rebuilt, a choice that made her as much an outlaw in Texas as any Comanche warrior. But it was Miguel's reaction that surprised everyone most. Instead of being frightened by the violence and danger, he had spent the evening pestering the returning warriors with questions about their horses, their weapons, their hunting techniques. He showed no fear of these men who scalped their enemies and painted their faces for war, treating them instead like the uncles and older brothers he had lost when the Rangers burned his village. The boy has the heart of a warrior, strong. Bear Woman observed, watching Miguel attempt to draw a tiny bow that one of the young men had made for him. But also the gift of prophecy. First he dreams of buffalo where none were expected. Then he sees hidden enemies that escape the notice of experienced scouts. Perhaps the spirits have marked him for great things. That night, as the village celebrated both successful hunt and victory over their enemies, Catalina found herself truly alone for the first time since fleeing her burning home. Miguel was already asleep, exhausted by the day's excitement, and the sounds of drumming and celebration drifted across the camp like music from another world. She sat outside her teepee, looking up at stars that seemed brighter here on the open prairie. Nocona found her there, no longer the painted warrior she had first encountered, but simply a young man carrying the weight of difficult choices. He settled beside her without invitation, and they sat in comfortable silence for a time. Two people who had discovered that mercy could be more dangerous than hatred, but infinitely more rewarding. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally. And she knew he wasn't talking about warning the hunters, but about the entire journey that had brought her to this moment. Did she regret leaving behind everything she had ever known for a life among people she had been taught to fear? Did she regret raising her son in a culture that would make him forever an outlaw in the land of his birth? "Ask me in winter," she said quietly, watching a shooting star arc across the vast Texas sky. "When the cold winds blow and Miguel asks me to tell him stories about his father, ask me then if I regret the choices that kept him alive." But even as she spoke the words, she knew the answer would be the same, that she would make the same impossible choice every time if it meant her son would live to see another sunrise. The celebration continued late into the night, drums echoing across the prairie like the heartbeat of the earth itself, and Catalina fell asleep to the sound of voices raised in songs that honored the buffalo, the hunt, and the strange Mexican woman who had chosen to become Comanche when it mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her commitment to this harsh but honest way of life. But tonight, for the first time since Joaquin's death, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like she was part of something larger than her own grief and loss. Miguel slept peacefully beside her, his small hand curled around a Comanche prayer stick that was already replacing his wooden cross as a symbol of protection. And in his dreams, she hoped he was running free across endless grasslands on a horse that could carry him anywhere his brave heart desired to go. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the sound of Nocona's voice joining the celebration songs, his deep baritone weaving through the other voices like thread through a tapestry, and she realized that he too was finding his way back to belonging after the choices that had changed them all. In saving Miguel, he had discovered something about himself that mere warfare had never revealed. The letter arrived on a day when winter threatened the horizon with gunmetal clouds, carried by a half-breed trader whose allegiances shifted like prairie grass in the wind. Thomas Whitehawk had been born to a Kiowa mother and French father, making him trusted by neither white nor red, but useful to both for the dangerous work of crossing between worlds. His weathered face bore the scars of men who had learned too late which side he truly served. Crowfeather took the message with the grim expression of a man who had been expecting bad news for months. The paper was expensive, the kind used by government officials and army commanders, and the red wax seal bore the eagle that marked it as official correspondence from someone with real power in the white man's world. He passed it to Nocona, whose seasons of schooling at the missionary station made him one of the few in the village who could read English. "What does it say?" Catalina asked, though the terrible stillness in Nakona's face already told her the answer would change everything. Miguel played nearby with the wooden horses the warriors had carved for him, his laughter a bright counterpoint to the darkness gathering in the adult faces around them. She had learned to read these silences over the months of her integration into Comanche society. Nakona's voice was carefully neutral as he translated, but she could see the fury burning in his dark eyes. Colonel Marcus Thornton of the Texas Rangers offers a reward of $500 for information leading to the capture of the Mexican woman and her son who have been living among hostile Indians. He claims they possess vital intelligence about Comanche movements and must be returned to face justice for their crimes against the state of Texas. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The sum was staggering. More money than most frontier families would see in 5 years of hard work. But it was the phrase about vital intelligence that made Catalina's blood run cold, because she realized that her knowledge of the village's location, its defenses, and its seasonal patterns really could spell doom for these people who had become her family. In the wrong hands, the information she carried in her head could guide an army straight to their winter camps. "There's more," Nakona continued, his jaw tight with controlled rage. "Any Indian found harboring these fugitives will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. The army is authorized to use whatever force necessary to retrieve the captives and punish their captors." The threat was clear and terrifying in its implications. The entire village now carried a death sentence because they had shown mercy to a widow and her child. Strong Bear Woman spoke into the silence that followed, her voice carrying the practical wisdom of a leader who had survived more than 40 winters of frontier warfare. $500 will turn many hearts toward betrayal. Even among our own people, there are some who would trade lives for gold. We cannot assume our location remains secret now that this bounty has been declared. But it was Miguel who asked the question that cut to the heart of their dilemma, his child's directness piercing through adult complexity like an arrow finding its mark. "Mama, why do the Rangers want us so badly? We didn't steal anything from them." His innocent confusion highlighted the bitter truth that they were being hunted not for what they had done, but for what they represented. "Because we chose to live," Catalina answered quietly, kneeling beside her son and trying to find words that would explain the incomprehensible cruelty of racial hatred to a child who had never seen color in the friends who surrounded him. "Because we survived when they wanted us to die, and because we found a family among people they consider their enemies. They cannot allow such choices to go unpunished." The council that convened that evening was unlike any Catalina had witnessed during her months in the village. Not just the elders and war chiefs, but every adult member of the tribe crowded into Crowfeather's lodge, their faces grim with the knowledge that they faced a decision that could destroy everything they had built in this hidden valley. The air was thick with sage smoke and the weight of impossible choices. "We could move the village," suggested Broken Arrow, the young warrior who had initially opposed accepting the Mexican refugees. "Winter is still a moon away. We could cross the Red River into the nations, find sanctuary among the Cherokee until the Rangers lose interest." But even as he spoke, his voice carried the uncertainty of a man proposing solutions he didn't believe. Grey Wolf, the oldest of the war chiefs, shook his head slowly. "The Rangers never lose interest. They will follow our trail through snow and mud and drought until they find us or die trying. Moving the village only delays the confrontation while weakening our position for when it finally comes." His words carried the bitter wisdom of a man who had spent 60 years fighting an enemy that never tired and never forgave. It was the blind elder, Singing Crow, who spoke the truth that everyone else had been avoiding. Her milky eyes seemed to look through the walls of the lodge toward some distant vision as her cracked voice filled the space between them. The spirits did not bring these two to us as a gift. They brought them as a test. Will we abandon them to save ourselves, or will we prove that Comanche honor means more than Comanche survival? The debate that followed lasted until dawn, voices raised in passion and fear and desperate hope as the tribe wrestled with a choice that pitted survival against honor, pragmatism against principle. Some argued for delivering Catalina and Miguel to the Rangers themselves, buying safety with betrayal. Others advocated for making a final stand in the valley, dying with weapons in their hands rather than fleeing like rabbits. But it was Miguel himself who provided the answer, speaking in a voice that seemed too mature for his 7 years as he sat beside his mother in the circle of arguing adults. "The Rangers killed my papa and burned our house," he said simply, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight like still water. "If you give us to them, they'll kill us too, and then they'll come kill all of you anyway, because they'll say you were hiding us. Bad men don't keep promises." The child's logic was unassailable, cutting through hours of complex debate with the clarity that only innocence could provide. Colonel Thornton and his Rangers weren't offering a genuine bargain for peace. They were simply trying to divide the tribe against itself before launching the attack they had always planned. Delivering the refugees would only provide them with intelligence for their inevitable assault. Crow Feather rose slowly, his old bones creaking like leather in the cold, and when he spoke, his voice carried the finality of a man who had made his peace with death. "The boy speaks wisdom beyond his years. We will not trade lives for promises that reek of lies. Catalina and Miguel are Comanche now, and we protect our own." The declaration sent murmurs of approval through the lodge, but also undercurrents of fear. "Then we prepare for war," Nakona said quietly, and Catalina felt her heart break at the resignation in his voice. This man who had saved her son's life, who had risked everything to show mercy to strangers, was now watching his world collapse around him because of the choices that mercy had demanded. She wanted to tell him to reconsider, to save his people by sacrificing her, but she knew the words would be wasted breath. The preparations began immediately, with scouts dispatched to watch every approach to the valley, while the women and children began packing the most essential possessions in case rapid flight became necessary. But even as they prepared for the worst, life in the village continued with the stubborn persistence of people who refused to let fear define their existence. It was during these tense days of preparation that Catalina discovered something that changed her understanding of everything that had happened since that day by the creek. She was helping Strong Bear Woman inventory the tribe's medical supplies when she found a leather pouch filled with documents that the older woman quickly tried to hide. "What are those?" Catalina asked, her curiosity overcoming her usual deference to the war chief's wife. Strong Bear Woman was silent for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to trust her with whatever secret the papers contained. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she spread them out for Catalina to examine. They were letters, dozens of them, written in Spanish and English, and even some in French. But what made Catalina's hands tremble as she read them was the realization of what they represented. Correspondence with Mexican officials, American army officers, even politicians in Washington. Strong Bear Woman, the fierce Comanche matriarch, had been conducting her own secret diplomacy for years. "You've been trying to make peace," Catalina breathed, her voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "All this time, while the men have been raiding and fighting, you've been trying to find a way to end the killing." The letters told a story of patient negotiation, of a woman who understood that endless war would eventually destroy her people. No matter how many battles they won, Strong Bear Woman's face was stone, but her eyes held pain that spoke of years of frustration and failure. Peace cannot be made with men who see us as animals to be exterminated. I have tried, sent messages to every official who might listen, offered compromises that would have saved lives on both sides. But they want our land more than they want our friendship. The Rangers found out, Catalina realized, the pieces of a larger puzzle finally clicking into place. That's why they're so desperate to capture Miguel and me. We're not the real prize. They want to use us to expose your peace negotiations, to prove that you've been secretly communicating with their enemies. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If the Rangers could prove that Strong Bear Woman had been conducting unauthorized diplomacy, it would justify any level of brutality against the tribe in the name of national security. The letters could be twisted to suggest treason, espionage, a grand conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of American expansion into Texas. Catalina and Miguel weren't just refugees anymore. They were pawns in a game much larger than their own survival. "Why are you telling me this?" Catalina asked, though she already suspected the answer. Strong Bear Woman's weathered face showed an exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. The bone-deep weariness of a woman who had carried too many secrets for too many years. "Because you understand the white man's world in ways we do not," Strong Bear Woman replied, carefully folding the letters and returning them to their hiding place. "You know how they think, how they justify their cruelties to themselves. If we are to have any hope of surviving what is coming, we need someone who can speak their language and understand their strategies." The weight of this new responsibility settled on Catalina's shoulders like a yoke made of lead and obligation. She had thought her greatest challenge was learning to tan buffalo hides and speak Comanche. Now she was being asked to help navigate the treacherous waters of frontier politics, where a single, misunderstood word could mean the difference between survival and extinction for an entire people. But before she could respond, the sound of galloping horses echoed across the valley, and both women froze as they recognized the urgency in the hoofbeats. The scouts were returning, and their haste could only mean one thing: the Rangers had found them at last. The time for planning and preparation had run out. Miguel appeared in the teepee entrance, his young face bright with excitement rather than fear. "Mama, there are soldiers coming, lots of them with flags and big guns." His childish enthusiasm for the spectacle was heartbreaking in its innocence, and Catalina pulled him close as she heard the war cries beginning to echo through the village. Through the teepee's entrance, she could see warriors painting their faces for battle, while women gathered children and elderly into the safest lodges. Nakona appeared outside, no longer the gentle healer who had saved Miguel's life, but once again the fierce fighter she had first encountered by the creek, his war paint fresh and his weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. "How many?" Strong Bear Woman called to him, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Even facing the destruction of everything she had worked to preserve, she remained the steel-backed matriarch who had held the tribe together through decades. "Of warfare and hardship, 200, maybe more," Nakona replied grimly, checking the edge of his war lance with practiced precision. "Infantry, cavalry, and a mountain howitzer that can blow apart our earthworks like they're made of prairie grass. They're not here to take prisoners this time." His assessment was delivered without emotion, but Catalina could see the grief in his eyes for the battle he knew they couldn't win. The irony was bitter and perfect. In trying to save one Mexican woman and her child, the tribe had doomed itself to the very destruction they had spent generations avoiding. But as Catalina looked around at the faces of people who had become her family, she saw no regret in their expressions, only the grim determination of warriors preparing to die for their principles. As the first cannon shot echoed across the valley like thunder from a clear sky, Catalina made a decision that surprised even herself. She kissed Miguel's forehead, whispered instructions to Strong Bear Woman about keeping him safe, and walked out of the teepee toward the sounds of approaching war. If her presence had brought this doom upon these people, then perhaps her actions could still prevent the worst of it. The battle for the hidden valley was about to begin, and for the first time since that day by the creek when Nocona had lowered his weapon at her feet, Catalina Reyes was ready to pick up arms of her own. Catalina walked through the chaos of preparation with a strange calm settling over her like morning mist on still water, her mind working with crystalline clarity as she studied the approaching army through the gaps in the rocky canyon walls. Colonel Thornton had positioned his forces exactly as she would have expected from a man trained in conventional warfare. His troops arranged in textbook formations that assumed they were facing an enemy who would fight by civilized rules. But these weren't Mexican bandits or Apache raiders who would meet cavalry charges with wild courage and little strategy. These were Comanche warriors who had spent generations perfecting the art of asymmetrical warfare, turning the vast emptiness of the plains into their greatest weapon. Thornton's orderly lines would mean nothing if the tribe could force the battle to become the kind of running fight where superior numbers meant less than superior knowledge of the terrain. "You're thinking like a general," Nocona observed, appearing beside her with the silent grace that had allowed him to watch her unseen. That first day by the creek, his war paint was complete now, red and black designs that transformed his familiar features into the mask of an ancient god of war, but his eyes remained gentle when they looked at her. "I'm thinking like a woman who has lost everything once and refuses to watch it happen again," she replied, her voice steady despite the thundering in her chest as another cannon shot echoed across the valley. "Colonel Thornton expects you to fight like the Apache or the Kiowa, with honor and fury, but little coordination. What if you don't give him what he expects?" The plan that emerged from their desperate conference was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its requirements. Instead of defending the village in a siege that could only end in massacre, they would abandon the valley entirely, but not in the panicked flight Thornton anticipated. The evacuation would be a feint, designed to draw the army into a canyon system where their superior firepower would be neutralized and their disciplined formations would become death traps. Strong Bear Woman listened to the strategy with the calculating expression of a woman who had spent decades weighing the cost of survival against the price of honor. "You're asking us to sacrifice our winter stores, our lodges, everything we've built here," she said quietly, her weathered hands never pausing in their work as she continued preparing medical supplies for the wounded they all knew would come. "Better to lose possessions than lives," Catalina answered, though the words felt like ash in her mouth as she watched Miguel helping the other children pack their most treasured belongings. "The Rangers want to destroy your people's ability to exist as a free nation. They're counting on you to make a desperate stand that will justify their slaughter. If you refuse to play their game by their rules, you rob them of the glorious victory they need to claim." The most dangerous part of the plan fell to Catalina herself, a role that even she recognized as likely suicide, disguised as strategy. Someone had to stay behind to ensure that Thornton's forces followed the fleeing tribe into the canyon trap, and that someone had to be valuable enough to pursue, but expendable enough to sacrifice. The logic was inescapable, even as it carved hollow spaces in the hearts of people who had come to love her. "I won't let you do this," Miguel said fiercely when he overheard the adults discussing the plan, his 7-year-old voice carrying an authority that would have been comical if it hadn't been so heartbreaking. You promised Papa you would take care of me, and I promised I would take care of you too. We stay together always." His small hands gripped her skirts with desperate strength, but it was Nakona who provided the alternative that changed everything, his warrior's instincts finding the flaw in their strategy that none of them had considered. "Thornton didn't come here for revenge or glory," he said slowly, his dark eyes distant with thought. "He came for those letters that strong bear woman has been hiding. If we can make him believe he's captured the real prize, he might be willing to negotiate rather than fight a battle that could cost him half his command." The gamble was insane and desperate and perfectly suited to their impossible situation. Instead of fleeing or fighting, they would offer Thornton exactly what he wanted: a face-to-face meeting with the Mexican woman who had been living among the Comanche, ostensibly to negotiate her surrender, but actually to buy time for the tribe's real evacuation. It was a plan that required Catalina to walk directly into the enemy camp with nothing but words as weapons. "You'll be killed the moment they recognize you," Strong Bear Woman protested, her usual stoicism cracking as she contemplated sending another woman to almost certain death. "These rangers are not honorable soldiers who respect flags of truce. They're killers who see diplomacy as weakness." Her concern was born of bitter experience with men who used negotiations as opportunities for treachery. But Catalina had already made her peace with the possibility of death. Her mind focused on the larger game they were playing against, forces that sought to erase her adopted people from the face of the earth. "Colonel Thornton needs me alive to legitimize his actions," she said with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Dead, I'm just another casualty. Alive, I'm proof that his mission was justified and his methods were necessary." The transformation began immediately, with Strong Bear Woman and the other women working to remake Catalina's appearance from Comanche warrior back into Mexican refugee. They braided European-style flowers into her hair, dressed her in the torn and patched clothing of a captive, even applied subtle makeup to create the appearance of abuse and maltreatment that Thornton would expect to see in a woman who had been held prisoner by savages. But the most important part of her disguise was psychological rather than physical. The careful construction of a persona that would appeal to Thornton's assumptions about Mexican women and Indian captives. She had to appear broken enough to be believable, desperate enough to seem genuine, but clever enough to manipulate the colonel into making the mistakes they needed him to make. Miguel watched the transformation with the solemn intensity of a child who understood that he was seeing something historic and terrible, his young mind processing concepts of sacrifice and deception that should have been decades beyond his comprehension. "Will you really leave us, Mama?" he asked quietly, and the question cut deeper than any physical wound she had ever received. "Never," she replied, kneeling to hold him close while being careful not to disturb the careful illusion of her appearance. "Sometimes people have to go away to protect the ones they love, but that doesn't mean they stop being family. Remember that, mi corazón. Remember that love doesn't end just because people can't be in the same place." The words were a promise and a prayer combined. The white flag she carried as she walked toward the ranger camp was cut from a petticoat that had once been her wedding dress, the same silk she had worn when she married Joaquin in what felt like another lifetime. The symbolism wasn't lost on her as she approached the enemy lines that represented everything that had destroyed her old life and now threatened her new one. Colonel Marcus Thornton proved to be exactly what she had expected. A tall, thin man with pale eyes and a mouth that suggested he had never smiled without calculating the advantage it might provide. His uniform was immaculate despite the dust and heat of the Texas plains, and he wore his authority like armor that protected him from having to see his enemies as human beings. "So you're the famous Mexican captive," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the casual contempt of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. You look surprisingly well for someone who's been held prisoner by savages for months. Almost as if you've been treated as a guest rather than a captive." The accusation in his tone was clear and dangerous. Catalina had prepared for this moment, rehearsing not just her words, but her entire performance, down to the way she would hold her shoulders and the tremor she would allow into her voice. "They kept me alive because they needed someone who could read and write English," she replied, allowing just enough defiance into her tone to seem authentic, while avoiding enough to appear threatening. "And your son?" Thornton pressed, his pale eyes studying her face for signs of deception. What possible use could Savage have for a Mexican child? The question was a trap, she realized, designed to force her to reveal information about Miguel's prophetic abilities or his unusual rapport with horses. "He amused them," she said simply, calling upon every lesson strong bear woman had taught her about the power of appearing harmless. Children are precious to the Comanche, even Mexican children. They saw him as good luck because he survived the fever that should have killed him. The partial truth was more believable than any lie she could have constructed. The negotiation that followed was a deadly game of chess played with words instead of pieces, each player trying to extract information while revealing as little as possible about their own position. Thornton wanted to know about Comanche numbers, weapons, defensive positions, winter plans. Catalina fed him carefully crafted half-truths that would support the strategy her adopted people were even now implementing. But it was Thornton's casual mention of Washington politics that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy she had stumbled into. "The Secretary of War is very interested in your experiences," he said, pouring himself whiskey from a silver flask while offering her nothing. "There are those in the capital who believe the Indian problem requires a final solution, and your testimony about Comanche brutality could provide the justification they need." The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity as Catalina realized that her capture was meant to serve a purpose far beyond simple justice or revenge. She was to be paraded before Congress as living proof that Indians were irredeemable savages who tortured innocent women and children, providing political cover for policies that would make the current frontier warfare look like a gentleman's disagreement. "What if I told you the truth?" she asked quietly, meeting Thornton's cold stare with steady eyes. "What if I testified that the Comanche treated me with more kindness and honor than your rangers showed my husband and neighbors? When they burned our village, the challenge hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre." Thornton's laugh was dry as desert wind and twice as cutting. "Who would believe you? A traumatized Mexican woman defending her captors. Congress would assume you were suffering from the same madness that afflicts all Indian prisoners who survive. Too long in captivity, your testimony would be dismissed as the ravings of a damaged mind." The casual cruelty of his assessment struck Catalina like a physical blow, not because it wounded her personally, but because it revealed the complete impossibility of justice within a system that had already decided the outcome before hearing the evidence. No amount of truth or eloquence could penetrate minds that had been sealed shut by prejudice and political necessity. "Then why do you need me at all?" she asked, genuine curiosity overcoming her fear as she tried to understand the deeper game being played around her. "If my testimony will be dismissed, regardless of what I say, what's the point of this elaborate charade?" The question seemed to catch Thornton off guard, as if he hadn't expected such directness from a supposedly broken captive. "Because appearances matter in politics," he replied after a long pause, his voice revealing more than he probably intended about his own complicity in the larger conspiracy. "The public needs to see that we made every effort to save you, that we risked soldiers' lives to rescue an innocent victim. Your survival justifies whatever methods we used to achieve it." The full horror of her situation crystallized in that moment as Catalina understood that she had never been meant to survive her rescue. Her testimony was irrelevant because dead. Martyrs told more compelling stories than living witnesses who might contradict the official narrative. Thornton hadn't come to capture her. He had come to create a tragedy that would serve his master's political agenda. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Catalina felt a spark of fierce hope as she realized that Thornton's confidence in his control over the situation might be his greatest weakness. He saw her as a helpless pawn to be moved around the board at his convenience, never suspecting that she might have learned to play the game herself during her months among people who had been fighting for their survival since before his grandfather was born. "I understand," she said quietly, allowing defeat to creep into her voice while her mind raced ahead to the possibilities his arrogance had revealed. "When do you want me to return to the village to convince them to surrender?" The question was bait, carefully crafted to appeal to his desire for an easy victory that would minimize his own losses. Thornton's pale eyes lit with satisfaction as he took what he thought was her capitulation at face value. "Tomorrow morning, you'll go back under a flag of truce and tell them that resistance is hopeless, that surrender is their only chance for merciful treatment. If they agree to lay down their arms, I give you my word as an officer that the women and children will be spared." The lie was smoothly delivered and utterly worthless, but Catalina nodded as if she believed every word. "And if they refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Thornton's smile was the expression of a man who had never entertained the possibility of failure. "Then we'll burn them out and let God sort the innocent from the guilty," he said with the casual brutality of someone who had never personally pulled a trigger but had ordered others to do so countless times. "Either way, this Indian problem gets solved permanently." His words carried the weight of official policy rather than personal opinion. As Catalina walked back toward the Comanche positions that evening, her mind was already working on the desperate gambit that might yet save her adopted family from the trap that was closing around them. Thornton had revealed more than he intended about his plans, his weaknesses, and the political pressures driving his actions. Now she had to find a way to use that knowledge before it was too late. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls. As she reached the hidden camp where the tribe waited for news of their fate, painting the rocks in shades of red that reminded her uncomfortably of the blood that would soon be spilled if her desperate plan failed. Miguel ran to meet her with the fearless joy of a child who still believed his mother could fix anything, and she held him close while trying not to think about how few hours they might have left together. "What did you learn?" Nakona asked quietly, his warrior's instincts reading the tension in her face even in the gathering darkness. Around them, the people who had become her family waited with the patient courage of those who had faced impossible odds before, and somehow found the strength to prevail. Catalina looked into their expectant faces and saw not the savages of Thornton's imagination, but the complex, honorable, deeply human community that had saved her son's life and taught her what it meant to belong somewhere. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction, and the choice between them might depend on her ability to play one final desperate hand in a game where the stakes were measured in lives rather than gold. "I learned that we're going to have to be smarter and braver than we've ever been before," she said simply, and began to outline the plan that would either free them all or destroy them trying. The night was young, and there was much work to be done before dawn brought the final reckoning to the hidden valley. The dawn came grey and bitter with the promise of snow, and Catalina stood at the edge of the canyon watching the last of the Comanche families disappear into the maze of hidden passages that would carry them to safety beyond the reach of Thornton's army. Strong Bear Woman had argued against the plan until the final moment, her weathered face tight with the knowledge that they were asking one woman to sacrifice herself for the survival of an entire people. But Miguel had surprised them all by understanding exactly what his mother intended to do, his 7-year-old wisdom cutting through adult complexity with the directness that only children possess. "You're going to trick the bad colonel," he had said matter-of-factly as she knelt, to say goodbye, his small hands framing her face with fierce tenderness. "Like Coyote tricks the hunters in the old stories Grandfather Crow Feather tells." "That's right, mi corazon," she had whispered, memorizing every detail of his face in case this was the last time she would see it. "And like Coyote, I'll find a way to come home to you. But if something happens, if I can't come back, you remember that you're Miguel Joaquin Reyes, son of Joaquin the woodcarver, and Catalina, who chose to be Comanche. You belong to 2 worlds, and you can be strong in both." Now she stood alone, except for Nocona, who had refused to leave despite her protests that his presence would only complicate the deception she was about to attempt. The warrior had painted his face not for war, but for mourning, the black and white designs that marked a man prepared to follow his loved ones into the spirit world if the day's work demanded such a price. "You don't have to do this," he said, quietly, his voice carrying the weight of words they had both avoided speaking during the long months of their growing closeness. "There might be another way, a path that doesn't require you to walk into Thornton's trap with nothing but hope and cleverness as your weapons." But even as he spoke, they both knew there was no other choice. The plan was audacious in its simplicity, and terrifying in its dependence on perfect timing. Catalina would return to Thornton's camp as agreed, but instead of convincing the tribe to surrender, she would lead the colonel and his forces into the very canyon system where the Comanche had prepared their own version of justice for men who made war on women and children. When she walked into the army camp carrying her white flag for the second time, Colonel Thornton's pale eyes held the satisfied gleam of a man who believed victory was already within his grasp. His soldiers had spent the night drinking whiskey and sharing stories about the atrocities they would commit once the fighting began, their voices carrying clearly across the desert air to where Comanche scouts had listened and memorized every boastful threat. "Have you convinced them to see reason?" Thornton asked without preamble, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of a man addressing a child or a simple-minded animal. Behind him, his officers clustered like vultures around a dying beast, their faces bright with anticipation of the slaughter they had traveled so far to orchestrate. "They will surrender," Catalina said carefully, allowing defeat and exhaustion to color her words, while her mind calculated distances and timing with the precision of a mathematician solving equations written in blood. "But their war chief demands to speak with you personally before laying down his weapons. It's a matter of honor," he says. The lie was exactly what Thornton's arrogance wanted to hear, confirmation that even savage chiefs understood the proper respect due to superior civilization and military might. His smile was the expression of a man who had never doubted that the lesser races would eventually acknowledge their betters and submit to inevitable conquest. "Where does this meeting take place?" he asked, already gesturing for his senior officers to begin preparing the column for movement. "And how many men will this war chief bring to witness his humiliation?" The questions revealed both his eagerness for theatrical victory and his fundamental misunderstanding of the people he was fighting. "He waits in the sacred canyon, 2 miles north of here, with only his medicine man and his eldest son as witnesses," Catalina replied, each word chosen to feed Thornton's assumptions about primitive tribal customs and ceremonial protocol. "He says the spirits of his ancestors must see him make peace with the white soldiers, or his people will never accept the surrender." What followed was a masterpiece of military incompetence disguised as tactical brilliance, as Thornton ordered. His entire command to march into terrain, perfectly suited for the kind of ambush warfare at which the Comanche had no equal. His mounted units led the way, their horses' hooves echoing off canyon walls that would soon channel their screams back to the desert sky. The trap was sprung with the devastating precision that comes only from generations of practice as warriors, who had been waiting motionless among the rocks since before dawn, suddenly materialized like spirits given flesh and fury. But this was not the mindless slaughter that Thornton had planned for the village. This was warfare elevated to the level of art, each shot and thrust calculated to disable rather than kill. Catalina watched from her position on the canyon. Rimmer's the army that had come to exterminate her adopted family found itself surrounded and helpless, their superior numbers meaning nothing in terrain where a single rifleman could hold off a squadron of cavalry. Below her, Thornton's confident shouts turned to desperate orders and then to screams of pure panic as his organized formations dissolved into chaos. But the most devastating blow came not from Comanche weapons, but from Catalina's own voice. As she stood on the rocks above the trapped army and began to speak, her words carrying clearly through the thin desert air to every soldier cowering behind inadequate cover. What she revealed in those moments transformed a military defeat into a complete moral collapse. "You came here to murder women and children," she called down to them, her Spanish accent lending exotic authority to accusations that hit like physical blows. "Your colonel told me yesterday that your orders come from Washington, that you're here to create martyrs for political theater, not to rescue captives or bring justice to the frontier." The effect on Thornton's men was immediate and devastating. As soldiers who had believed they were serving their country's honor suddenly understood, they were merely tools in a conspiracy that had nothing to do with protecting civilization from savage threats. The revelation that their own government had sent them to commit atrocities for political gain struck harder than any Comanche lance. "She's lying!" Thornton screamed from his position behind an overturned supply wagon, his voice cracking with the desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed narrative crumble into dust. "She's been tortured and broken by months of captivity. Don't listen to the ravings of a damaged mind." But his own words from their previous conversation rose to condemn him. "Tell them about the final solution," Catalina continued relentlessly, her voice growing stronger as she saw the doubt spreading through the army ranks like wildfire through dry grass. "Tell them about the Secretary of War's plans to exterminate every Indian tribe between the Mississippi and the Pacific. Tell them how their children will judge them when they learn what their fathers did in the name of manifest destiny." The psychological warfare proved more effective than bullets, as individual soldiers began laying down their weapons rather than continue fighting for a cause they now understood to be fundamentally corrupt. The sight of their own men refusing orders broke what little discipline Thornton had managed to maintain, and his shouts of command became increasingly shrill and ineffective. It was Miguel who ended the battle, appearing on the canyon rim, beside his mother, with the fearless innocence that had first saved their lives by the creek so many months before. His young voice carried clearly through the sudden silence as he called down to the defeated army with the directness that only children possess. "Why do you want to hurt my mama and my new family?" he asked, his Spanish accent making him sound even younger than his 7 years. "We never did anything bad to you. We just want to live and take care of each other like families are supposed to do." The simple question struck the assembled soldiers like a revelation of their own lost humanity. The surrender that followed was unlike anything in the history of frontier warfare, as an entire army laid down their weapons not in defeat, but in revulsion at the mission they had been sent to accomplish. Individual soldiers began removing their uniforms, declaring their intention to desert rather than return to Washington to report success in a campaign that had revealed the moral bankruptcy of their government's Indian policy. Colonel Thornton's final act was to draw his sidearm, not to continue the fight, but to end his own life, rather than face the court-martial that would surely follow his spectacular failure. But even this last gesture of desperate pride was denied him, as Nakona appeared beside him with the silent speed that had made him legendary among his people. "Death is too easy," the Comanche warrior said quietly, knocking the pistol from Thornton's trembling hands with casual contempt. "You will live to explain to your superiors how an entire regiment was defeated by the testimony of one Mexican woman and the innocence of a child who asked the right questions." The humiliation was more complete than any bullet could have made it. In the years that followed, the Battle of Sacred Canyon became a turning point in the history of the American frontier, not because of the military casualties involved, but because of the political earthquake it triggered in Washington. The revelation of the government's systematic genocide plans, confirmed by the testimony of soldiers who had abandoned their posts rather than participate in atrocities, led to congressional investigations and the downfall of officials who had believed their crimes would remain forever hidden. But for Catalina and Miguel, the most important outcome was simpler and more personal. They had found a place in the world where they belonged, where the color of their skin and the language of their birth mattered less than the content of their characters and the loyalty they showed to their chosen family. The Comanche people, freed from the immediate threat of extermination, were able to negotiate a genuine peace treaty that recognized their right to exist as a sovereign nation. The sacred canyon where the battle had taken place became a pilgrimage, site for people of all races who wanted to honor the memory of what happened when ordinary individuals chose to stand against systematic evil. A small monument marked the spot where Miguel had asked his innocent question, its inscription reading simply, "Here, a child spoke truth to power, and power was ashamed." Strong Bear Woman lived to see her secret diplomacy vindicated by official recognition from a chastened government that finally understood the cost of choosing war over negotiation. Her letters, once hidden in fear, became part of the historical record that documented both the crimes committed in the name of manifest destiny and the persistent efforts of indigenous peoples to find peaceful solutions to conflicts that others had declared irreconcilable. And Nakona, the warrior who had first lowered his weapon at the feet of a crying woman by a lonely creek, became known throughout the territory as a man who had proven that mercy could be more powerful than vengeance when applied with wisdom and courage. His story was told around campfires for generations, a reminder that the choice between violence and compassion was always available to those brave enough to take it. On quiet evenings in the rebuilt village, Catalina would sit with Miguel and tell him stories about his father Joaquin, ensuring that the boy never forgot the man who had given him life, even as he embraced the people who had given him a future. The wooden cross that had once been his most precious possession now shared space on his chest with a Comanche medicine bundle, symbols of a heritage that spanned two worlds and rejected neither. The last entry in Catalina's journal, written on the 10th anniversary of that terrible and wonderful day by the creek, captured the essence of what she had learned during her transformation from refugee to peacemaker. Love is not something that divides us into tribes and nations. Love is what reminds us that we all belong to the same human family, even when fear and hatred try to convince us otherwise. The story of the woman who shed tears by the creek with her son, and the Comanche scout who lowered his sword at her, feat became legend throughout the frontier territories. It was told in Spanish around Mexican hearths, in English in frontier schoolhouses, and in Comanche around sacred fires, a reminder that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through the courage to see enemies as potential friends and to choose hope over hatred, even in the darkest of times. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.